a mountain man discovers a 13-year-old pregnant girl left to die, tied to a tree in the brutal Wyoming wilderness of 1879. His decision to save her will transform them both in ways neither could have imagined. But can one act of mercy truly rewrite the measure of a man's worth? Ice crystals formed on Josiah Creek's mustache as he breathed into the bitter Wyoming wind. The winter of 1879 had arrived early, painting the mountain peaks white and driving most sensible folks indoors by their fires. But Josiah wasn't most folks. He was a man who'd learned to find peace in places where others found only death. His boots crunched through knee-deep snow as he led his pack mule down the narrow trail. Behind him, the animal carried enough supplies to last through the worst months ahead. Dried beans, salt pork, ammunition, and a precious bag of coffee beans he'd traded his last silver dollar for in the settlement. The mule snorted clouds of steam into the freezing air, as eager as Josiah to reach the warmth of his cabin. Something felt different today, though he couldn't name what. Maybe it was how quiet the forest had become, no bird songs, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Josiah had spent enough years in these mountains to know when nature was trying to tell him something. He stopped walking and listened. There, carried on the air like a ghost's whisper, came a sound that made his blood run cold. It was human, weak and desperate, a cry for help that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. "Hello?" he called out, his voice booming through the silence. The cry came again, fainter this time, from somewhere deeper in the trees. Josiah tied his mule's lead rope to a sturdy pine and pulled his rifle from its leather case. Whatever was making that sound might be in trouble, but in this wilderness, trouble often wore different faces. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Following the sound through a grove of bare aspens, their white trunks standing like ghostly soldiers in the snow, Josiah pushed deeper into the forest. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, and his breath came in short puffs that disappeared almost instantly in the dry air. Then he saw her. A young girl hung limp against the trunk of an ancient cottonwood, thick ropes binding her arms behind the tree. Her head drooped forward, blonde hair falling like a curtain over her face. But what made Josiah's heart nearly stop was the obvious curve of her belly beneath her torn dress. She was heavy with child, and from the look of her, not far from giving birth. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered, rushing forward. Her skin had turned the pale blue of frostbite, and when he touched her neck to check for a pulse, she felt cold as mountain stone. But there, weak and fluttering like a bird's wing, he found the beat of life still fighting inside her small body. As he worked to cut her free with his hunting knife, questions raced through his mind. Who would do such a thing? How long had she been here? Most importantly, would he be able to save both her and the baby growing inside her? The girl's eyes fluttered open as Josiah caught her falling body, revealing the pale green color of spring water. She tried to speak, but only managed a whispered croak that he had to lean close to hear. "Please don't hurt me," she begged, her voice barely stronger than the wind through pine needles. "I'm not going to hurt you, child," Josiah said gently, wrapping his heavy coat around her shaking form. "My name's Josiah Creek. I'm going to get you somewhere warm." She nodded weakly, then winced as pain shot across her face. Her hands moved to her belly, and Josiah could see the baby moving restlessly inside her, as if sensing the danger they were all in. "What's your name?" he asked, as he lifted her onto his mule, making sure she wouldn't fall. "Mercy," she whispered. "Mercy Caldwell." "Well, Mercy Caldwell, how did you end up tied to that tree?" Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks, cutting clean paths through the dirt and frost on her skin. "My aunt and uncle. They said I brought shame to their family. The baby, they called it cursed because—" She stopped, unable to finish. Josiah felt anger burn hot in his chest. He'd seen cruelty before, had even been guilty of it himself in his younger days. But leaving a pregnant child to freeze to death in the wilderness was beyond anything he could understand. "They drove me out into the mountains," Mercy continued, her voice growing stronger as feeling returned to her body. "Said if God wanted me to live, He'd provide a way. If not," she shrugged, the gesture heartbreaking in its acceptance. "How long were you there?" "Since yesterday morning, I think. I lost track when the snow started falling again." Josiah calculated quickly in his head. She'd survived nearly 2 days in below-freezing weather while pregnant and without food or water. The girl was tougher than she looked, but even the strongest person had limits. As they made their way through the forest toward his cabin, Mercy began shivering uncontrollably despite the warmth of his coat. Her teeth chattered so hard he worried she might bite her tongue. The baby seemed to sense something was wrong too. Josiah could see constant movement beneath her dress, little feet and elbows pushing against her skin. "Is the baby coming now?" he asked, dreading the answer. "I don't know," Mercy admitted. "Everything hurts so much, I can't tell what's normal and what isn't." They traveled the last mile in worried silence, both of them knowing that surviving the cold was only the first challenge they faced. Mercy would need food, rest, and proper care if she was going to deliver a healthy baby. And Josiah, a man who'd lived alone for 3 years, who'd never been around children, who barely knew how to take care of himself, would somehow have to figure out how to save them both. But as his cabin came into view through the trees, smoke still rising from the chimney he'd banked that morning, Josiah made himself a promise. Whatever it took, however hard it might be, he wouldn't let this girl and her unborn child die on his watch. Thunder rolled across the mountain peaks as Josiah carried Mercy into his log cabin, her body limp as a broken doll in his strong arms. The storm had been chasing them for the last mile, and now fat raindrops began pelting the roof like angry fists demanding entry. Inside the one-room shelter, everything spoke of a man living alone. Animal furs covered rough wooden chairs. Dried meat hung from the ceiling beams. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold ashes waiting for new flame. Josiah laid Mercy on his narrow bed, her pale face almost white against the dark wool blankets. "Stay with me, child," he whispered, lighting the oil lamp with shaking hands. In the golden glow, he could see how thin she was beneath that swollen belly. Her ribs showed through the torn fabric of her dress. Purple bruises marked her wrists where the ropes had cut deep. The baby moved inside her, a ripple across her stomach that made Josiah catch his breath. Life fighting to survive despite everything working against it. He'd seen plenty of death in his 42 years, but this was different. This was hope wrapped in the most fragile package he'd ever held. He heated water in his biggest pot, tearing strips from his cleanest shirt to make bandages. Her fever burned hot against his palm when he checked her forehead. Outside, lightning split the sky in half, flooding the cabin with white light for one terrifying second. Where am I?" Mercy's voice came out like rustling leaves. "Safe," Josiah said, wrapping a warm blanket around her shoulders. "You're safe now." She tried to sit up, but he gently pushed her back down. "The baby, still there, still fighting, just like you." He ladled hot broth into a wooden bowl, blowing on it to cool it down. "Can you tell me what happened? Who did this to you?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "My aunt and uncle in Laramie. They said I brought shame to their house. Said the baby would curse their other children." Her hand moved to her belly, protecting what grew inside. "They drove me out to the woods and left me there." Josiah's jaw tightened. He'd seen cruelty before, but this cut deeper than most. "How long were you tied to that tree?" 2 days, maybe 3. I stopped counting when the snow started." She accepted the broth with trembling hands, sipping it slowly. "I thought I was going to die. I prayed for it, near the end. Well, prayer brought me to you instead of death." Josiah sat in the chair beside the bed, watching color slowly return to her face. "What's the father's name? Maybe he can help." Mercy's laugh held no joy. "Robert Henderson ran off to California the day I told him about the baby. Left me a note saying he was too young for such troubles." She looked at Josiah with eyes older than her 13 years. "Seems like everyone's too something when it comes to doing what's right." The storm grew stronger, rattling the cabin's windows. But inside, warmth was winning against the cold. Josiah added more wood to the fire, thinking about the girl's words. Too young, too old, too poor, too scared. He'd used every excuse in the book himself over the years. "What happens now?" Mercy asked, her voice getting stronger with each sip of broth. Josiah looked at her, really looked. Blonde hair tangled from her ordeal, green eyes that had seen too much pain, hands that should have been playing with dolls instead of holding her growing belly. But underneath all that suffering, he saw something else. Strength, the kind that bends but doesn't break. "Now you get well," he said. "Both of you." But even as he spoke those words, Josiah wondered what would happen when spring came and the mountain passes opened again. Would her family come looking? Would the law get involved? And what about him, a man with a past he'd rather forget, suddenly responsible for a pregnant child and an unborn baby? 3 weeks passed like pages turning in a favorite book. Mercy grew stronger each day, her cheeks filling out from Josiah's steady cooking and care. She moved around the cabin with increasing confidence, organizing his few belongings and bringing a woman's touch to the rough space. But it was during their evening conversations by the fire that Josiah discovered the sharp mind hidden behind her young face. "You taught yourself to read all these books?" she asked one night, running her fingers over his small collection. "Had to. No school where I grew up." Josiah poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "My pa said books were for people with too much time and too little work. My father believed the opposite. He said books held all the wisdom of the world." Mercy opened his copy of the Bible, its pages worn soft from handling. "He was going to send me to a real school back east before he died." "What happened to him?" "Fever took him during the winter of 1877. Mama followed 3 months later. That's when I went to live with Aunt Margaret and Uncle Samuel." Her voice grew bitter. "They made it clear I was a burden from the start." Josiah studied her profile in the firelight. "What did you want to be before all this happened?" "A teacher. I wanted to help children learn their letters, show them that words could take them anywhere they dreamed of going." She closed the book gently, her hand moving to her belly. "Silly, I suppose." "Not silly at all. Dreams are what separate us from the animals." But their peaceful routine shattered on a cold February morning when Josiah spotted riders approaching the valley through his telescope. 5 men on horseback, moving with the steady purpose of a hunting party. At the front rode a man wearing a silver star on his coat. "Mercy!" Josiah called, his voice tight with worry. "Come look at this." She joined him at the window, her face going pale as she recognized the lead rider. "Sheriff Coleman. He's my uncle's brother-in-law. What's he doing way out here?" "Looking for me." Mercy's voice shook. "Uncle Samuel must have convinced him that you kidnapped me or worse." Josiah lowered the telescope, his mind racing. 5 armed men against 1. Not impossible odds, but not good ones either. And with Mercy so close to giving birth, running wasn't an option. "There's something else," Mercy whispered, her hand gripping his arm. "Sheriff Coleman. He's the one who helped tie me to that tree." The words hit Josiah like a physical blow. A lawman participating in attempted murder. It changed everything about the approaching confrontation. "Why?" he asked. "His wife is Aunt Margaret's sister. He said they couldn't have their family name stained by my shame." Tears ran down her cheeks. "He told me I was getting what I deserved." Josiah felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd dealt with corrupt officials before, men who twisted the law to serve their own purposes. But this was different. This was personal. "Listen to me," he said, taking her hands in his. "Whatever happens when they get here, I won't let them take you back to that life. You can't fight 5 men, maybe not with guns. But there are other ways to fight." Josiah checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. Sometimes the strongest weapon is the truth. The riders were getting closer, their horses' hooves drumming against the frozen ground like a countdown to judgment. Mercy pressed against his side, her body trembling not from cold but from fear of what was coming. "What if they don't care about the truth?" she asked. Josiah looked down at her, this brave girl who'd survived abandonment and cruelty yet still found strength to hope. "Then we'll find out what I'm really made of." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Josiah knew that everything he'd built in this quiet valley was about to be tested in ways he'd never imagined. The sound of horses broke the morning silence like thunder across the valley. Josiah grabbed his rifle and peered through the frost-covered window, his heart sinking as he counted 5 riders moving down the hillside with deadly purpose. "They found us," he whispered to himself, then louder to Mercy, who was stirring soup over the fire. "Get away from the windows. Now." Mercy's spoon clattered to the floor as she saw the men approaching. Her face went white as fresh snow. "It's Sheriff Coleman," she breathed. "And my uncle." Josiah felt his chest tighten. He'd known this day would come, but that didn't make it easier. The riders spread out in a half circle around his cabin, their horses snorting clouds of vapor in the cold February air. Sheriff Coleman dismounted first, his badge catching the weak sunlight. Behind him, a thin man with cruel eyes climbed down from a black horse. This had to be Mercy's uncle, the man who'd left a child to freeze to death. "Josiah Creek," Coleman's voice echoed off the valley walls. "We know you've got the girl. Send her out and nobody gets hurt." Josiah stepped onto his porch, rifle held ready but not aimed. "Not yet. She's safe here, Coleman. That's more than you can say about her family. That girl belongs with her blood relatives," the thin man called out. His voice was sharp and angry. "I'm her legal guardian, and I've come to take her home." "Home?" Josiah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You call tying a pregnant child to a tree and leaving her to die home?" The other deputies shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Even they seemed troubled by what they'd heard. But Coleman raised his hand to quiet them. "What Walter Caldwell does with his ward is his business," Coleman said. "The law's the law. She's 13 years old and unmarried. She has to come with us." From inside the cabin came a sound that made every man present freeze. Mercy's voice, clear and strong despite her fear. "I won't go back to that place. I'd rather die first." Uncle Walter's face twisted with rage. "You hear that? The girl's been poisoned against her own family. Creek, you're nothing but a kidnapper, and probably worse." Josiah felt something hot and dangerous rise in his chest. For years, he'd lived alone because people like Walter Caldwell had made it clear he wasn't welcome among decent folks. They called him worthless, dangerous, a man with no future and a bloody past. But standing on his porch, protecting the girl who'd brought light into his dark cabin, Josiah realized something important. Maybe their opinion of him didn't matter as much as he'd thought. "I've got a solution," he said quietly. The deputies leaned forward in their saddles, curious. Even Walter stopped sneering. "The law says she needs a husband or a guardian," Josiah continued. "Well, I'm offering to be her husband." The silence that followed was so complete that Josiah could hear his own heartbeat. Coleman's mouth fell open. Walter's face turned purple with shock. "You can't be serious," Coleman finally managed. "You're old enough to be her father. And he's a better man than her actual family," came Mercy's voice from the doorway. She stepped out onto the porch, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "I accept his proposal." Walter Caldwell exploded like a firecracker on the 4th of July. "This is insane! You can't let a child marry a mountain hermit." But Sheriff Coleman was studying Josiah with new interest. The lawman had a reputation for following rules, but he also had eyes. He could see the way Mercy stood close to Josiah, unafraid. He could see how well-fed and healthy she looked compared to 3 months ago. "The girl's willing," Coleman said slowly. "And Creek's got no criminal charges against him that I know of." "What about his drinking?" Walter snarled. "Everyone in Laramie knows he used to be the town drunk." "Used to be," Josiah repeated calmly. "Haven't touched a drop in 4 years." One of the younger deputies spoke up for the first time. "Sheriff, maybe we should hear what the girl really wants." Coleman nodded. "Mercy Caldwell, step forward." Mercy walked down the porch steps, her chin raised high. She looked tiny next to the mounted men, but her voice carried clearly across the valley. "My uncle threw me out when he learned about the baby," she said. "He told the whole town I was wicked and shameful. Then he and his friends tied me to a tree in the woods and rode away." The deputies exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was the first time they'd heard the full story. "Mr. Creek found me half dead from cold and hunger," Mercy continued. "He saved my life and the baby's life. He's been nothing but kind and proper to me. If he'll have me as his wife, then I'll gladly marry him." Walter's horse danced nervously as he yanked on the reins. "She's lying! The girl's been coached!" "No," said the young deputy firmly. "I think she's telling the truth. And I think what you did was wrong, Mr. Caldwell." Sheriff Coleman held up his hand before an argument could start. "Here's what's going to happen," he announced. "If these two want to get married, and if they can find someone to perform the ceremony, then it's legal. The girl will be a married woman, and her husband will be responsible for her." "This is ridiculous," Walter shouted. "What's ridiculous," Coleman shot back, "is leaving a pregnant child tied to a tree. I've got half a mind to arrest you for attempted murder." Walter's face went pale. He looked around at the other men and saw no support in their eyes. Even his allies were disgusted by what he'd done. "Fine," he spat. "But when this arrangement falls apart, don't come crying to me. And when that baby's born and brings nothing but trouble, remember that I warned you." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of snow in his wake. Sheriff Coleman tipped his hat to Josiah and Mercy. "Congratulations on your engagement," he said with a slight smile. "Just make sure you find a preacher soon. I don't want any questions about the legality of this arrangement." As the lawman rode away, Mercy turned to Josiah with tears in her eyes. "Did you mean it?" she whispered. "About marrying me?" Josiah looked down at her, this brave, strong girl who'd faced down 5 armed men without flinching. "I meant every word," he said softly. "If you'll have an old mountain man like me." She smiled then, bright as sunrise over the peaks. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather have protecting us." Thunder rolled across the valley as Mercy doubled over in pain, her water breaking just as the first lightning split the dark sky. Josiah had seen this moment coming for days, but nothing could have prepared him for the fear that gripped his chest like iron bands. "It's time," she gasped, clutching the doorframe of their cabin. The storm outside matched the chaos within as Josiah scrambled to boil water and gather the clean cloths he'd prepared weeks ago. Rain hammered against the windows while Mercy's labor pains came faster and harder. He'd delivered countless animals, but this was different. This was the woman he'd grown to love and the child they'd both claimed as their own. "I can't do this," Mercy cried out during a particularly strong wave of pain. "Yes, you can," Josiah said firmly, wiping sweat from her forehead. "You're the strongest person I know." Hours passed like days. The storm outside grew fiercer, as if nature itself was fighting against this new life trying to enter the world. Josiah found himself praying to a God he'd nearly forgotten, bargaining with the heavens for safe passage for both mother and child. Just before dawn, when the storm finally began to quiet, a different sound filled the cabin, the sharp, angry cry of a newborn baby. Josiah caught the tiny, slippery form in his weathered hands, marveling at the perfect fingers and toes, the shock of dark hair that matched Mercy's own. "A boy," he announced, his voice thick with emotion he didn't bother to hide. Mercy reached up with trembling arms to hold her son, tears streaming down her face. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "What should we name him?" Josiah looked out the window at the clearing sky, where the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds. After so many years of darkness in his own life, this moment felt like the dawn of something entirely new. "Daniel," he said softly. "Daniel Creek. It means God is my judge, and I reckon that's fitting." As Mercy cradled little Daniel against her chest, Josiah realized that everything he'd ever wanted was right here in this small cabin. The baby's cries had already begun to settle into soft whimpers, and Mercy was humming a lullaby her own mother had once sung to her. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Josiah with eyes full of gratitude and something deeper, something that looked very much like love. "Thank you," he replied, meaning it more than any words he'd ever spoken. Outside, the storm clouds were moving on, leaving behind a world washed clean and bright with promise. Inside the cabin, a family had been born from the most unlikely circumstances, proving that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the deepest struggles. But even as joy filled every corner of their small home, Josiah couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. In a territory where news traveled fast and memories ran long, he wondered how long it would be before someone came looking for answers about the mountain man, the young mother, and the child, who would grow up never knowing his biological father's name. 5 years later, Daniel Creek could track a rabbit through fresh snow and read every word in his mother's worn Bible, skills that made Josiah burst with pride every single day. The boy had grown tall for his age, with his mother's quick mind and his adoptive father's steady hands. Their peaceful morning routine shattered when riders appeared on the ridge above their valley. Not lawmen this time, but something potentially worse. Josiah recognized the lead horse and felt his blood run cold. James Morrison, Mercy's uncle, had finally come calling, and he hadn't come alone. "Stay inside with Daniel," Josiah told Mercy, checking his rifle one more time. "I won't hide anymore," she replied, standing straighter than he'd seen her since that day he'd cut her down from the tree. "Whatever he wants, we face it together." Morrison dismounted with the confidence of a man who believed God was on his side. His traveling companions stayed mounted, hands resting near their weapons. "Mercy girl," he called out, "you've caused enough shame to our family name. Time to come home and face what you've done." "This is my home," Mercy replied, stepping onto the porch beside Josiah. "These are my people. That bastard child belongs in an orphanage where he can learn proper Christian values," Morrison snarled. "And you belong back in Laramie where you can beg forgiveness for your sins." Daniel appeared in the doorway, too young to understand the ugly words but old enough to sense danger. Josiah felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest, the same feeling that had made him cut Mercy's ropes all those years ago. "The boy stays with us," Josiah said quietly. "And so does his mother. They're my family now, legally and otherwise." What happened next surprised everyone, including Mercy herself. She walked down the porch steps, past Josiah, and stood toe-to-toe with the uncle who had once left her to die. "You want to talk about sin, Uncle James?" she said, her voice carrying across the valley like a bell. "Let's talk about tying a pregnant child to a tree in winter. Let's talk about turning your back on family when they needed help most." Morrison's face flushed red. "You were bringing shame." "I was 13 years old and scared," Mercy interrupted. "But I'm not 13 anymore, and I'm not scared of you." The confrontation might have turned violent, if not for Daniel himself. The 5-year-old walked straight up to Morrison, looked up at him with serious eyes, and asked, "Are you the bad man who hurt my mama?" Something in the child's innocent question seemed to deflate Morrison's righteous anger. He looked around at his companions, at the neat cabin and well-tended garden, at the family that had grown from the ashes of his own cruelty. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his words lacked conviction. As the riders disappeared back over the ridge, Josiah wrapped his arms around his wife and son, marveling once again at how love could grow in the most impossible places. Mercy had found her voice at last. Daniel was safe, and their little valley remained their sanctuary. But more than that, Josiah realized he'd found something he'd never expected, not just a family, but his own sense of worth. He was no longer the broken man who'd wandered into these mountains years ago. He was a husband, a father, and a protector of those who couldn't protect themselves.